Welcome to Slice of Life Sciences Real Estate. Thanks everybody for tuning in again for this week's episode. I'm thrilled and excited to be with a friend of mine, Dan Guadagnoli, who is a director at the Fallon Company. The Fallon Company is a privately held commercial real estate owner and developer, headquartered in Boston. I think founded in 1993, Dan. Owner and developer of transformative mixed-use environments with over $6 billion in developments in real estate, representing, I think, more than 6 million square feet now. HQ'd in Boston, like I said, but you guys are growing, which we'll talk a little bit about, with now offices in Charlotte, Raleigh, and Nashville now, the latest. So, Dan, thank you for joining.
Here, Dave. That was an unreal pronunciation of my last name.
I actually had to stumble on it for a second, but glad I got it right. I am Italian as well, so a little bit easier. Well, to get started, I always kind of like to dive into just you as a person, what your background is, and get into what you're doing now. But do you mind just sharing where you're from, where you went to school, kind of what you thought you were going to be doing growing up?
Absolutely. Great to be here. I'm from the area, kind of like yourself, Dave. Grew up outside of Boston, from Framingham, Massachusetts, and always grew up playing sports. I, just like yourself, was a big athlete growing up, and went to school locally as well, Bentley University.
Yep.
Studied economics and finance there, and then I was playing football and decided to do a fifth year, so got my master's in finance that fifth year. And I think at that point I kind of realized real estate was an area I wanted to go into. There's a lot of things that drew me to the industry, but always liked the built environment, always thought that neighborhoods and kind of the character of a city or a town was always something that intrigued me. So that part of it, kind of the design part of it, but also the investment part of it, were things that caught my eye when I was in college, and unfortunately wasn't able to get into the industry right out of school. I actually started at PwC, the Big Four accounting firm.
Yeah.
I was in the management consulting division.
You're good with your numbers. It helps with the spreadsheets.
Consulting division, and early on knew that I was going to try to make a pivot into real estate. And funny enough, my office actually moved from the financial district in Boston to Seaport right as I started working there, close to I think it was probably a couple of years into my job there. But that was a funny transition because my job now is at a company right across the street,
right across the street.
Obviously the Fallon Company. And so I've been able to see the Seaport just explode as one of the hottest submarkets literally in the country. So it's been an interesting case study, and been at the Fallon Company ever since, and loved every minute of it.
And what was the, I guess, the transition from PwC to the Fallon Company, and what were you, I guess, when you started at the Fallon Company, what were you doing? Kind of how has your role evolved over the years?
Sure. When I moved over here, we were in a position where we were starting to look at other markets outside of Boston. The company had done, like you alluded to, a ton of work in the city of Boston, some very major projects, the convention center hotel, several large apartment buildings, and obviously Fan Pier, which is a 20-acre site in Seaport, and where Vertex's headquarters is, and a bunch of other firms. So when I came onto the firm, we were actually looking to start to diversify in other markets. And so part of my job was to think through what other markets we may want to target, and help kind of source opportunities there, evaluate opportunities. And it was a great learning experience for me to just kind of cut my teeth and get right into the financials on development opportunities in new markets.
Yeah, and since it's new, completely foreign to me, how do you even go about, like, when you're tasked with trying to find a potential new market to kind of develop your first asset or whatever it is, what are you even
Yeah,
looking for, and where do you even start?
yeah. So you, you start very macro level, and you have to kind of pick your bets, if you will. So if you're looking everywhere, you're not looking anywhere. Obviously, you have to be focused. But obviously, you start with where's the population growth happening and where are the jobs. A lot of that comes down to geography. Some of it comes down to um, major drivers that are intrinsic to an area that won't change. So in our market in the Boston area, we obviously have the unbelievable higher ed landscape and the medical landscape, right? So the colleges we have here, the medical and research institutions, those aren't going anywhere. So you look for similar themes, and what we've picked up on, and it's no secret, is that a lot of people who are in markets like Boston, New York, San Francisco, those gateway markets, a lot of firms and people have moved into markets that are have a lower cost of business, lower cost to do business, markets that have really favorable political landscapes. So you've seen a ton of population growth in Texas,
Yep.
Florida, the Carolinas, obviously Nashville, and there's a handful of other markets I could allude to, and a lot of that's driven by the tax political landscape and how friendly they are to businesses. Some of it's driven by just quality of life metrics, right? Like
Yep.
how's the weather?
Yeah.
How's the culture there? How do people experience their day-to-day lives? And so a lot of people have moved to Charlotte. A lot of people have moved to Raleigh, and those were markets that we identified and we felt like had a long runway. And when you actually look at it from an investment standpoint, and you look at the returns that you're able to generate in a market like Boston, and then you compare it to Raleigh, Charlotte, and some of these other growth markets, you start to see a pretty compelling narrative that obviously it's higher risk when you're going into another market that may be a little bit less proven, but there's better potential for returns. So part of it was driven by that, and that those markets had more opportunities just from a financial perspective.
And is your mission from that standpoint of, or the investments you make, whether opportunistic, core investments, value add, is that pretty similar throughout the markets you're in, from Boston, Charlotte, Raleigh, or Nashville, or is it Charlotte's going to be more risky than Boston, and we know that going in, et cetera?
So our firm we're a nimble firm, so we're able to kind of pick and choose what type of investments we want to pursue. But generally, we're really a development firm at our core.
Yep.
So most of what we do is pretty large scale mixed use development. Normally has multiple phases associated with it, so it's normally not just one building. It's normally multiple. But to answer your question, Dave, I think at any given point in time, in any given market, we're able to kind of reassess what the best opportunity may be and kind of tweak our perspective as needed. So we're lucky in that regard. We're a smaller firm that has a very kind of nimble culture to us. But the way we went into those markets was really to bring that mixed use urban type of large scale mixed use development, to bring that into markets that may not have been as sophisticated at the time. Now you're seeing a lot of capital flood into those markets, so they're very they're prime time markets. There's no doubt about it. But what we do largely is opportunistic, large scale development.
To like kind of piggyback on the nimble aspect, obviously there are trends that go on in commercial real estate every year, every so many years, and you see a lot of what appears to be reactive kind of decisions being made, whether it's like lab conversions, whatever it is, whatever the hot topic is at that moment. I think it's super interesting, and it's one of the best case studies I've ever heard is the Vertex case study for you guys. Well, the reason I'm bringing it up is because it wasn't, in my opinion, or from what I know, as adaptable and flexible, kind of going with the flow. But you guys were really trailblazers in that decision of what went on in the Seaport. Um, for something like that, Vertex was in Kendall Square, the epicenter of biosciences in the world. And you guys had a development at Van Pier and attracted them to basically move from Kendall Square to their new headquarters, which is still there in the Seaport. What goes into that master plan? How many different types of people are you talking to? I imagine it's not just the 6 people in your team and at the Fallon Company. There's obviously a lot of government folks, different groups, and public leaders that you have to kind of get the buy-in to make a Vertex want to move to the Seaport and be essentially the first lab tenant in the Seaport, which is now the next big thing.
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll try to.
Yeah, I don't even know what the specific question was. What are your thoughts?
So that was before my time, obviously, when Vertex came to the Seaport, and that was definitely a defining moment. Joe Fallon founded the company, obviously, and he had just an unbelievable team of people that really were trailblazers at the time. And the cool thing, Dave, is that mindset that you're describing has stayed with the company in terms of the willingness to kind of see beyond what's happening today and try to make bets on what might happen in the future. So it's always a give and take between, looking ahead to what might be, but also recognizing that the capital markets they are looking at certain product types today for a reason, right? Like financial partners and banks love industrial because industrial's obviously a proven asset class right now, but there's going to be something else in the future that will be very attractive that somebody else is thinking of right now that may not be in vogue today. So you're always balancing between what is proven and what's reactionary versus what's kind of proactive. But to answer your question about what goes into a master plan, that's probably my favorite part about real estate is just the complexity of what goes into choosing a site and taking a project from parking lots with no activity to like a amazing neighborhood, which is what Seaport is right now. And absolutely, so government officials are a huge piece of it. It's not necessarily just the government officials, but it's just understanding what the political landscape is at any given moment, right? So that ties into zoning, that ties into the community and who's active in the community and who the stakeholders are for the project. So when you look at a site, you literally need to think through who are the major stakeholders that I need to speak with to understand what the development potential is for this area and what's likely to either support or impede future development. In Boston, and the other thing, Dave, it's different in every city. So in Boston, most sites need to be rezoned. Most sites require a very complex approvals process in order to be able to actually build a project, right? So if I go find a site somewhere in Boston, I could be looking at a 2-year period before I can actually have a permitted site that's ready for construction. In other cities, like our experience in Raleigh and Charlotte is a lot different. Those cities had recently underwent updates basically to their zoning code. So they had already thought through that these parcels in downtown Raleigh are going to be 40-story buildings that can accommodate residential, office, hotel, etc. So you buy a site like that, and it's a lot smoother of a process because you're buying something that's already entitled.
Yeah.
So it depends on the city. So some cities require more kind of due diligence on the political and entitlement front. So we call that entitlement risk a lot of the times, especially in Boston when there's a long period and a complex process for getting a project from where you are today to an approved project ready for construction. When you look at a site, though, that's one piece of it is kind of your political and your approvals process and how that's going to function and what the risks are there. Obviously, you've got to design something and you've got to know that it's marketable. So typically early on when we're evaluating a site, we'll bring in an architect usually who puts together kind of a few quick schemes that we think may work for the site. And that's obviously a collaborative process. So generally, you look at a site as a developer and you have an idea in your mind what uses you think will work, right? So you look at a site and you might think this would be a great lab site, but we'd also love to do residential here. So you then might bring an architect on board. This is before you've acquired it. This is during your kind of evaluation process. This all happens very quickly. You might bring an architect on board and have them throw together a couple different schemes in a matter of 5 or 10 days that help you understand what type of development you might be able to do on the site, right? So you do that. You're talking to the community and stakeholders to understand, what the appetite is from a kind of a community/political perspective. You're probably talking to an attorney, a land use attorney, depending upon the site, to understand what the entitlement risk is and what the approvals process will be like. And you might need to bring in different, sub consultants like a civil engineer or an environmental engineer, because you want to evaluate the environmental risk of the site if it's in a contaminated area. So there's a lot of different players, and the job of the developer at a high level is to reduce risk as time goes on. So you start out and there's a ton of risk before you've done any of this stuff, right? And you're basically trying to check these boxes to eliminate risks. But at a high level, there has to be a business plan that you as the developer, as the entrepreneur, really believe in with the site. So you love the site because it's located in an area that is on the path of growth, in a market that has great job growth, population growth, and you feel like you can attract residents to live there, office users, lab users, retail users, what have you, because of the location and because of some intrinsic value that the site provides. And then your job from there is to evaluate what the right development program is and reduce risk and start to understand the property more and more and more as you dig into it.
For a long-winded question, an abstract question I asked, that was a great complex response.
It's a long-winded answer.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, like the business plan you mentioned from something like Vertex, which I think was in 2011 or so, just around that time,
yep,
to now you're just in the same exact neighborhood, a stone's throw away, the Mass Mutual development. Is that part of the original business plan to kind of have a building, whether it's office or whatever it is, in that plot of land, or is that kind of go in phases and you assess every 3 years, 5 years, or whatever it is?
A little bit of both, but at the beginning, when you first started out, you definitely need to kind of put a stake in the ground in terms of how the buildings are going to lay out on the site. So it might change a little bit over time as you react to changing market dynamics, but something like that, there's so much complexity in terms of how infrastructure connects between the buildings, how the parking works between the buildings. We have some interconnected parking garages, how the roadways work. And there's a lot of coordination there, obviously, with the city and even at the state level, because it's a big project and it affects so many different stakeholders, both public and private. So something like that, Dave, you're definitely establishing kind of your boxes, if you will, at the beginning of the project as to where buildings are going to go. And when you get it approved, you have approvals for certain uses. So Fan Pier, the project you're alluding to, certain parcels are zoned for residential, others are zoned for commercial. So if we had to change a use on a particular site, there's a mechanism to do it, but we'd have to go back through an approvals process in order to do that. So the vision, a lot of it was, at the outset of the project, you hope that things unfold the way they did. And once you had that momentum with Vertex that kind of established this neighborhood, the dominoes starting to
Yeah.
fall, and now
Each asset can play off one
that
another.
building with the Mass Mutual site is a site that would be one of the best sites in the city because
Yep.
of how much this neighborhood is just exploded. Right? It's incredible the amount of jobs that have been created in this area and all the companies that have moved here.
Yeah, and like you said, each development just enhances the other development as well because it really forms that neighborhood. Out of curiosity, just because Vertex is, I think, over 1 million square feet, Mass Mutual's 300 something thousand square feet. What's the difference between, or when you're talking to a Vertex or a Mass Mutual or someone of that size, a true anchor tenant, between a build to rent versus a build to own, that the actual company might say, we want ownership in this development versus we're just going to partner with you to develop it and then rent it?
Good question. I think build to own is probably an outlier from a developer's perspective. We're betting on a site, and our job is to attract tenants to rent a building that we're ultimately providing. Right? That's the product we're providing, and there's a rent that we think works based upon the budget required to deliver a product that we think is a top of market product. So in the case of the rent situation, if you had a tenant come and say, so I'll just back up, right? If we bought a plot of land and we're marketing a building, first of all, we would normally start from a place to assume it's a multi-tenanted building. It's pretty rare to start permitting a plot of land and then have a tenant come by and say, we want the whole building. That's a dream scenario. So you're starting from a place to say, how can we market this building in a flexible way to a variety of users? So in the event that we have multiple tenants, we're able to accommodate all the tenants, and obviously they're going to be renting in that case. If you've got one big user that says, we want the whole building, we love this location, and they're not very sensitive to cost or rent, they just want the location, they're going to have more influence over the design and just more influence in general compared to a multi-tenanted situation, obviously, where you as the landlord need to maintain more control because the building is going to be rented to more users. In a situation where a tenant wants to not only take the whole building but also own the building, they would have a lot more influence. And there's different ways to structure that. You might have a structure, Dave, where the tenant rents from you, but then has a right of first offer or right of first refusal, which means on a sale,
if you were looking to sell it, that they would have.
If you were looking to sell, exactly. If you were looking to sell in the future, they'd have the opportunity to buy it. Or you might have a scenario where they buy it right out of the gate, and in that scenario, the developer, you're charging a fee regardless, right? That's a development fee. So that's more of what we call a fee development, where you're kind of building it on their behalf.
Yep.
And they're going to be owning it, and you charge a fee. And you may also do what's called a cost plus, where you may say that if the budget is, X, you might sell it for X plus some sort of return metric. So you kind of predetermine what that sale price is based upon a budget that obviously everyone has to agree upon and may be in flux for a period of time. But once you nail down that budget, you may have an agreement with the tenant or the future owner to buy it from the developer at a certain predetermined price point. A lot of that hinges on the source of the capital in terms of the developer's capital stack and how they finance the project to begin with. There's a lot of developers have, third-party equity backing them, and it could take a variety of forms. But that third party equity, a limited partner, a lot of times you call them LPs, that money might have a certain requirement for return on investment. So it's not always as simple as the developer being able to make a quick call. There's often capital backing the developer that has their own set of requirements. So the moral of the story is, in most cases, it's you market a product that can be rented to multiple
Yep.
tenants, and in most cases, that's what you end up with. If an anchor tenant comes by that wants to take the whole building, it's a great scenario for the developer. You're usually going to give them more control in terms of design and other influence on the project.
With that, I guess, in mind and that experience, what are you working on now, and kind of what's in the pipeline? I mean, I'm sure you can't say everything specifically, but what's exciting you and keeping you busy these days?
Yeah, so in the satellite offices that we've opened up, we've got a lot of exciting stuff going on. The last few years, we've kind of been teeing up various opportunities in Charlotte, Raleigh, and now Nashville. We opened up an office in Nashville about a year ago now. So working on some deals, kind of in their early stages in Nashville and also in Boston. So trying to grow the pipeline there. Fan Pier, our project in Boston that we've been talking about, does have one more site, one more parcel. So like you said, Mass Mutual wrapped up, but we also have another parcel on Fan Pier. So those two markets, we're a little bit farther out for our next kind of large scale project. But in Charlotte and Raleigh, we've got two great projects that are in our pipeline. The one in Charlotte's called Center South. It's mostly a residential development, actually. It's about 745 units of apartment units, a large office building as well. And then in Raleigh, we're actually underway right now with a 300,000 square foot office building in downtown Raleigh, which it was obviously terrible timing with COVID. Kind of hit right during our construction period, but the team's been very resilient, and the building seems to have, we had a pre-lease luckily for 50% of the building, so that
helps with the stress of COVID.
It helps with the stress. Leasing's ongoing, and that's a huge focus area for us. And we'll look to tee up more projects in that market for sure. We have a second phase of that project teed up right now, which we think will be a residential component. And we're still looking for more opportunities. Both those markets, Charlotte, Raleigh, and Nashville, there's no shortage of growth. So we're kind of working between managing what we have in our current pipeline and executing that, and then looking for future opportunities. And like we talked about at the beginning of our call, trying to think of, what might be novel or what might be out there that not a lot of people are thinking of right now, and how can we, maybe go against the grain a little bit to find opportunities that others might not be right now.
We're running up on time here, but one question: what's one word? If you could describe the Fallon Company in one word, what would it be?
Wow,
That's a tough question.
On the spot.
Glad you're on the receiving end of it.
I would say passionate.
I like that.
It's just a really fun place to work. Everyone in this office is so passionate about what they do, and they genuinely just love coming into work. So it almost reminds me of being on a sports team where everyone's rowing in the same direction for a common goal. It feels that way, and it's hard to create that culture in the corporate world. It's tough. I mean, you know how tough it is.
You don't get as sore as playing Saturday morning basketball, so that's also a plus.
But it scratches that itch for sure. That kind of competitive, passionate. That whole aspect of work is something that I hadn't experienced in my previous jobs, and it's really cool to be in a place like that. And I think it's something that continuously makes work different every day. It's never the same every day. We're always looking for more opportunities and pushing ourselves. So I would say passionate for sure.
Great. That was a great answer. All right. Well, great, Dan. Thank you so much. Really means a lot for you to jump on. Had some great content. So everyone, hope you enjoyed the episode. Stay tuned for next week. And Dan, thanks again.
Thank you, Dave. This was great. We'll talk soon.
See ya.
Take care.